Hey there, friends and fiends, and welcome to the first episode of the Wizardly Warehouse Productions podcast. Wapapapa! So, without further ado, we're just gonna hop into it. James and I are going to just be tackling some D&D hot takes today and just seeing what conversation we spark off of here, and you get to see kind of what our professional and personal opinions are on all things D&D today. So welcome to the first episode. So happy to have you. James, any words before we dive right into these intense questions?
Honestly, just buckle up, everyone, and we both hope that you really enjoy this. So, Eric, I know you've got the juicy one. Take it away.
Okay. All right. So our first one here today, folks, is the standard D&D 5th edition rules are far too combat focused and lead people away from actually role playing.
You know what? Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say that it has to be.
Okay.
Because the majority of the roleplay for Dungeons and Dragons is intended to be spontaneous and you describing what you're doing, what your character wants to do, and say, and think, and feel. And so, therefore, leaving only one other option available for them to give you mechanics for, and that's combat.
Hmm.
What do you think about that?
I mean, ultimately, as much as I would like to disagree with you, I have to say, like you said, like right out of the box, literally the box set, where you get your DMG, your player's handbook, and your monster manual, like the DMG itself, and that might be also a whole nother hot take on its own.
I
But
have some words about the DMG.
yeah, so I'm sure you do. But this is the best part about this. We just start, it just starts branching to so many
Y-
directions.
y- you
But,
know what? No, do you mind if I jump in?
well, let me answer
Yeah.
this question first, okay? Because then otherwise we're going to get tangential. And next thing you know, people are going to be part of our workplace conversations.
Ooh.
Um, I know it could get down a deep hole. Now, so anyways, getting back on center. My thoughts on this are ultimately, as much as I would like it not to be the case, I do have to agree with you right out of the gates, right out of the box. Ultimately, fifth edition does concern itself more heavily with the combat mechanics, because I would argue for I guess the marketing strategy that they had in regards to the fifth edition. I would say fourth edition was far more focused and heavy on the actual like combat as a combat simulator, and I know that could spark a whole nother thing for you as well. Okay, so I would say this person might not have ever played fourth edition,
Or
because I
3.5.
yeah, because I would say those editions were far more so than this one. But on the flip side, where I'll give them a little bit of credit, even if they're a newer and younger person in general, but a newer to the hobby, is ultimately are the other pillars as equally fleshed out ad nauseum? And the answer simply for that one, I would say, is no, because is there a lot of advice for how to facilitate and how to develop and how to um, generate role playing situations? Far less so. And I think there's a lot more guidelines to certain scenarios in their published adventures that kind of try to do that a little bit. But I would agree that the way the spells, the features, and the mechanics of classes, especially, are done, it does make people focus, especially like even in role playing scenarios, of what spell or what social mechanic, if they have any for their subclass, could be utilized in this situation. So then people are always thinking a little bit more mechanically based rather than just enjoying the scene that they are a part of and that their character is in. Perchance on just base level.
So I'm going to quickly jump back to the 4th edition and the 3.5 edition.
Nice.
So 4th edition definitely was more of a D&D like combat simulator. They had the at-will spells, or abilities, they had your encounter abilities, and they had your dailies. So it was really focused more on that combat side of things. Combat was also like very, very fluid, I found when I played 4th edition.
Hmm.
However, 4th edition was not my first rodeo with D&D. I started in 3.5. Now, a thing about 3.5, to put things in perspective, the first time a paladin gets the closest thing to a spell was level 5 or 6.
Mm-hmm.
If you were lucky. Now, that being said, how does that pertain to the role-playing? Well, nobody really got spells until 5th or 6th level. There were no cantrips. There was no casting, Eldritch Blast until your brains fall out? No. It was simply, you have X amount of spell slots for the day.
Okay.
So what ends up happening is you were forced to figure out a way to avoid combat until you were higher level, or until you had figured out unique ways to go through combat in 3.5.
Ah.
So I would say that a big complaint about 3.5 that I recall was that, yeah, combat was like exceptionally dangerous in 3.5 up until the point of like level 5 or level 6, because nobody really had spells or major abilities. It was just like whack them with a stick and hope you hit. So it really did force that critical thinking, but it did keep a lot of people away from the game because it wasn't as easy to start. And that doesn't mean that difficulty of the game is directly delineated with new players or new people.
Yeah.
It's just there were so many finite rules and things that needed to be accounted for in 3.5 that hardcore gamers absolutely loved. But it was not casual in a in general terms.
Gotcha.
So it was very hard to pick up. It did require a fair bit of study. But once you got into it and you started leveling up, things got a lot easier. And then I think there was also the controversy around like level 10 or 13 and 3.5 as like one of the spellcaster types. You essentially become a god, like just untouchable.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
So altogether, I think that 5th edition really does have a well-rounded approach to roleplay and combat, but it does focus more on combat because it leaves the roleplay aspect up to you. So
Yes, I agree.
that's my thoughts there.
I'm with you as well. And just a quick last caveat point to that before we carry on. And I'd like to explore that DMG one. Like, we can get to another hot take later because I think we stumbled on one of our own hot takes. But yeah,
Yes.
my last caveat with that, to reinforce your point about 5th edition, one of my personally, like, it's my personal favorite classes, and it's one that I constantly am trying to push farther into the limelight. Besides the paladin, is the ranger. Okay, but a ranger is only as good as your DM, and that could be a hot take too. But honestly, and I mean this in the sense of, does your DM actually incorporate any of the survival mechanics that are in 5th edition? And on top of that, the survival mechanics in 5th edition are, just simply put, way too mundane and not threatening enough for the Rangers' survival mechanics and a lot of its class specific abilities to really have as much of an impact as they should, in my personal opinion. To really make you feel and make the party feel like, thank goodness we've got this Ranger, we'd be dead. There is one exception, however, and that is the recent Rime of the Frost Maiden campaign module, and that's where they incorporate more, like, I would call it, like if you've played Skyrim on hardcore mode, where like you literally need to eat and drink like every few hours, and like warm up by a fire, or your character will die of like starvation, thirst, and cold, right? um,
Hmm.
they actually incorporate a lot of that stuff into Rime of the Frost Maiden, and for once, one module where the Rangers actually, like, they're foraging and like they're, being able to have no disadvantage in tough terrain, all of a sudden becomes key and clutch. But other than that, so thus as well weak in terms of the exploration and, in that regard, role playing of 5th edition, because we're more focused on, well, how do we kill goblins at level 1 and live to tell a tale.
So I need to dip back to 3.5 again. Oddly enough, and this is interesting because the Ranger was one of the classes I looked at first. So my initial class I was going to play for D&D was a Druid.
Mm-hmm.
And then I looked at the Ranger, and after studying the rules well enough, Rangers were essential in 3.5
Mm-hmm.
because you needed to have that foraging for food. You needed to be able to tell which direction you were heading.
Yeah.
You needed to be able to tell what weather was coming up, uh, how to properly survive in and outside of dungeons.
Yes.
And yes, I totally agree. I think Rangers have essentially a backseat in 4th and 5th edition.
Like, they've literally spent, sorry to just hop in there, but they've
Yeah.
literally spent the last 2 years in particular with a lot of the other supplements and, a lot of the other subclasses, like trying to beef up and essentially redo the Ranger. And they've redone it in Unearthed Arcana like twice. And then on
Yeah.
top of that, in Tasha's, they finally redid and brought some justice to the Beastmaster Ranger, so it actually operates like intended. So yeah, man, I couldn't agree more.
I also think that there's a couple of things about D&D hot takes that can really be swept under the rug as just general answers.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's on your DM. But here's the problem. If the tools and the assets are not made available or known to the DM, how are they supposed to make it work?
Nice, dude. That was the best segue. That was the best segue into the second part, which is the DMG, right? So carry on, good sir. Keep going.
The DMG is just a guideline. Let me say it one more time for the people in the back. These rules are more like guidelines.
True, and I would say absolutely, because even the way that it's written, there's about 60% fluffy, nice language in there to help you learn how to do descriptive language, and
Honestly,
but
within the first
40%, is
Yeah.
actually rules, right? But a lot of those rules, like, there's not like bullet points and like, this is how, right? If A then B, it's more like, well, if you have an A or a B, it could be like, you know what I mean?
it honestly, within the first 5 pages, it tells you that everything in that book is a guideline.
Yes.
The only hard and fast stuff it really tells you how to do is like, hey, if your player's trying to climb a ladder, it's athletics, not acrobatics. There you go.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, is that in the DMG, it just gives you like, I don't know, like 80 pages of like spells and abilities to just, or is none of that. hang on, hang on. Let me correct myself before I'm talking out my butthole here.
Oh, okay,
Um,
okay.
so it does give you a bunch of spells. It does give you a bunch
Oh
of
yeah,
just like
for
generic information,
that's right. Yep.
but at the end of the day, I think there was an old mentality, and I say old dubiously because I'm looking for a better word here, but 3.5, fourth edition, certain rules needed to be followed
Mm.
because
Oh,
that's how the
yes,
game worked.
yes.
It was based around those rules. Now, let's also look at a holistic thing, and this is going to be something that I can drop into your pool a little bit more. It's more poli-sci side of things.
Mm.
You look at the player base for 3.5, and I would hazard it was far less than the, what, 26, almost 30 million players that are currently into D&D right now.
Yeah.
I would say it was probably closer to maybe 2 million.
A
Maybe.
lot more niche, a lot more. Yep.
Absolutely. A lot more niche. So having a hard and fast system was a lot easier at that point because out of the, let's say, 2 million people, you'd have maybe 20-30% as DMs, right?
Yep.
So you only had to have 20 to 30% of people actually deal with the rules on a regular basis, and most of them, like many GMs, are gonna have exceptions or change the rules to fit their campaigns. Scaling this up to now 30 million people, what do you think happens when you have such restrictive rules? Right?
Yeah.
Things start to break apart at the seams, and that scales for things in real life. I mean, politics, economies, everything, right?
I'm with you on that one. Essentially, how I could break it down with what you're getting at is direct democracy works really good, as we know, in small communities where it can be actually done, right? And then as soon as you scale that up to a large scale community, like you can't honestly do direct democracy anymore safely, which is then why you need representatives to then go to the Senate, which is a small place with fewer people, which, long story short, it gets back to that direct democracy sort of council and hearing and decision making, right? But then, of course, there are so many issues and flaws that come along with that. So I agree with you in that sense of this is kind of the same thing that has happened with D&D is, with the growth and with the different strategies and with 5th edition being designed to be one of the more easier to walk into and welcoming systems that they have created, yet they've had to make cutbacks in other areas in order to make that happen, right?
Exactly. And unfortunately, the Rangers and Paladins and a couple other classes, I'm sure, have really felt that pinch
Mm.
where the rules don't
Support them.
reinforce their position.
Yeah.
They're just kind of like, you play this class because you want to,
Yeah.
right?
I agree. And I think that's why classes like the fighter, the rogue, and the wizard slash sorcerer have right out the gates. Okay, other classes, yes, like I mean, we could say at this point now because of how much material and how long fifth edition's been out, a lot of things have been remedied. But I'm talking straight out the gates, vanilla fifth edition, right? Those four classes, absolutely, hands down, the easiest to play and the easiest to learn because the rule set supported them so adamantly. Whereas any class that has any sort of like deeper role playing or exploration based or for clerics, paladins, faith based sort of not just hit them all over the head
Yeah.
mechanics involved, those are intrinsically tougher to learn, number one, then to play, number two, and then as a result, number three, incorporate and then like embody properly at the table. I completely agree.
Exactly. And to break that even down to its grassroots, let's look at the most basic party composition. Tank, damage dealer,
Mm-hmm.
support, ranged.
Yeah, and I think yeah, you literally just nailed it, and
You got
unfortunately,
you got your fighter, your
yeah.
rogue, your cleric, and your wizard.
Yeah, exactly. So exactly, and those are those four things embodied, right? That most people, and most people, I would argue, that are getting into D&D right now, of the many million we have now, I mean, come from. I mean, they're generally speaking, statistically, from this year's uh, D&D, um, not stakeholder. I think stakeholder. Yeah, stakeholder meeting where they had all the infographics and where I was just nerding out. As you know,
Yeah.
I love me metrics. Um, Vast majority of them are much younger, and a crowd that would have grown up playing video games or and is still currently playing video games, right? And so,
Yep.
as much as I know that they say and they tout not wanting to like fall into like MMORPG sort of mechanics, I
Yeah.
would say that, the way that they designed it is that if you want to play that way, you can, right? And that's also, I think, on the flip side, kind of what ended up coming back to bite them a little in the butt is like certain subclasses or certain players that want to play a certain way and are looking for that in their subclass, then all of a sudden would be found lacking or find something lackluster or find that the rules of the games did not support those mechanics, or the mechanics did not help them with in conjunction with the rules of the game to get their desired effect, which would be, I mean, the greatest one for me is people wanting to be this badass healer, but that's just not what's supposed to happen in D&D 5th edition, at least. That there are ways to kind of do such thing, but generally speaking, we can't have a healer like that because otherwise that will break the game. We can't have a healer like be able to like look after an entire party.
That's called a solo class. And
Yeah.
let's take that MMORPG thing for a quick run around the block.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have both played World of Warcraft.
Oh
I've
yeah.
played EverQuest and EverQuest 2. As the games progressed, it was very easy to see ways that classes were filtered down to solo classes. So EverQuest 1, I believe, later on, much later on before its initial launch, necromancers became the go-to class because you can have like 2 pets, you can feign death, you can resurrect things, you can do lots of damage, and your pets will tank for you.
Yeah.
Why would you need a group?
Ah, I see. Yep.
EverQuest 2 eventually had similarities for necromancers and other pet faring classes. But let's jump into World of Warcraft, the biggest one. You tell me two classes up to the point of, well, I didn't play much of Legion, did you?
That was the last thing I played through. Yep.
Okay, so up to Legion, what were the 2 classes that you could just solo everything with?
Well, I'm gonna let you answer that one. Because, I mean, my experience with World of Warcraft was a lot more cursory. I was always just that RP nerd. So,
Fair enough.
but I do know from my experience in Legion, having watched some stuff and like I was, trying to get myself up to date. I do know that oh god, this is either gonna make us sound dumb or bad. Oh, I'm on the it's the demon hunter class. The hunter
Yes.
class is ridiculous. Literally can solo whatever. And then also, I mean, there's a lot of ways, especially the way the game is designed right now. But I'm gonna let you answer that question because I know you've got the answer. Like, I don't
So
wanna, you know what I mean?
so I'll
Because I
back it
don't.
up
Because I don't.
to like Cataclysm then, because that was like my very final like, okay, I remember playing through this vividly.
Yeah.
Death Knight and Paladin,
Okay.
because you could essentially heal yourself by fighting
Mm-hmm.
for a Death Knight, and the more things you were hitting as a Death Knight, the more you were healing. And it didn't matter how much damage you could really do, because you'll just never die in a fight. The Paladin, let's face it, everybody knows about the bullshit shield. The whole like, oh, here's my 30 to 45 seconds of you can't touch me. And I'm just going to cast Healing Word on myself until I'm back at full health, and then I'm going to come out of this and smack you silly. And do it all over again until one of us either gets tired and logs off, or I beat you into the ground with my magical hammer.
Yeah. I got
Like, and that's the problem. That's why you can't have a cleric that's gonna do whack tons of damage and heal everybody crazy like at the same time.
I agree.
Now, yes, as you get higher in level as a cleric, you are gonna get some really frickin' wicked abilities, depending on your subclass.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
And that's the trade-off. You can do metric buttloads of damage as a cleric with the right subclass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you're limited in your healing.
Always. As like honestly, in fifth edition, there's a couple like, and they really need to stretch it with the feats, with the subclass, and like certain magic items in order to really pump out. But at the end of the day, like the way healing is done for player options in D&D fifth edition, you can't just be that solo healer. My job is to heal, and I'll make sure that we're all like at like 3/4 or topped off. Like, no. And it's important for the storytelling that it is not, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, I agree. I think, like, let's translate that to something like Lord of the Rings. Oh no! Let's say Aragorn turned around and used his healing abilities on everybody after every single fight.
Yeah.
That
Right?
suddenly it'd be like, oh, well, okay.
Yeah, the threat of death and actual death, like, or death saving throw situations is so important to just the stakes and the storytelling in D&D as far as I'm concerned. Um, and just having in certain big fights, you hit those moments even at really high levels. It's really important for a dungeon master to push players to these moments where they feel like they don't have enough, where they've run out of resources, and
Yes.
then they need to start actually like tapping into their noggin and like putting on the gears in terms of like, well, how the heck do we get out of this?
And you know what? I'm gonna circle into another question, but I'm gonna leave this topic off on uh, a note saying that that was what I really liked about fourth edition.
Mm,
Because if you dilly-dallied enough in fights, all your encounter spells are gone. Your daily spells are gone.
yeah.
And those are your big hitters. The at-wills were like, eh. You get a D6, a D8, maybe a D10 if you're really lucky.
Gotcha.
But without those encounter spells, without those daily spells,
That's it.
you were up shit's creek.
Yeah. I
And
gotcha.
I've been in fights where I used all of them. And I was like, guys, we have to kill this before. And it's really frightening because you start running out of your abilities, and when some of your heals are encounter spells, what are you gonna do? Start chugging your potions like you're in Skyrim? Shoving cheese wheels into your face? No! So, and that's where I wanted to leave off that one, because it is true. a lot of D&D right now is very combat focused because when you have such a broad game in its concept, which is make it up as you go,
Yeah, you
and
got to have
this
something that's hard and fast, and I understand that.
exactly.
Yeah.
And to quickly dip into my next point here, I think this hot take here on Twitter is really good for that. I think that the features for each class slash race are too heavily combat focused. Give us more utility slash fun abilities to use outside of combat.
Awesome.
You,
That is a good
you
hot take. And before we launch into it, I just letting you know, I gotta be the responsible moderator here. We are at the 30-minute mark already, good sir.
okay?
So
I
either we can literally leave these guys with a little teaser for our next episode on the Wizardly Warehouse Productions podcast, Wah-pa-pa-pa! Or we can go into what I call double overtime, and we can finish this if you'd like.
you know what? Let's kick off our first episode, make it big, and go into double overtime.
Okay, we're going into double overtime, folks. Here on, let's do it. 3, 2, 1. Wah-pa-pa-pa! Okay, so if you guys at this point, because of probably us just blowing your eardrums out, forgot what the hot take was, James, take it from the top again, and let's dive on in.
I think that the features for each class slash race are too heavily combat focused. Give us more utility slash fun abilities to use outside of combat, and to kick this one right to your court.
Okay.
4th edition had utility abilities instead of encounters. So my question to you is, if you could
Yeah.
take a feature or a feat
Yeah.
over spells or spell slots, would you?
Okay, I like this. This is good. I do appreciate that, because this is a good way to kind of guide us, and then we'll like bit by bit kind of get towards answering this. So ultimately, I would take, because some of the feats in 5th edition are truly, can be truly powerful and game changing, and honestly in places they can be, I would argue, game breaking, or DM make the DM struggle a little bit.
Yeah.
By rules as written. And here's the thing, this is why features are totally optional, and I understand that. I understand why there will be some tables that are like, heck to the no, we're just keeping this vanilla. But I would, because some of the features make up and give you a little bit more reach outside of the standard vanilla play, especially when we're talking about for utility and just expanding aspects of the game. So, I'll have a quick couple examples off the top of my head. Warcaster, that's huge for so many spellcasting subclasses, because if you want to play kind of a Gish character, as they say, like one that can be involved in melee combat, as well as being able to cast your spells, Warcaster is able to allow you to maintain that concentration better when you're in like melee combat, so that you're able to just kind of take some hits and maybe dish some out while maintaining concentration on a spell, which is huge. And then the one that everybody uses in so many different classes to just break the game and bump up their damage and their ridiculousness, but I love it myself because I exploit it as crazy as heck as any sort of ranger subclass, is the sharpshooter feat. Being able to just ignore 3/4 cover and never have disadvantage on a shot, and being able to take the minus, I think it's the -5 penalty to your roll, but getting just a solid like extra 10 damage on something. Like, those are my two examples to just talk about that, but still, that utility in and of itself is still combat focused, I'd argue. But there are some features in the game that are more utility focused. They're just not jumping up into my mind at this period of time. But there is the commander feat and the healer feat. These are our feats that classes that don't have those things, like if you don't have a good charisma and you want to be issuing some commands, or you know, you're
You
not
can replace it with your wisdom, right?
yeah, and then like for the healer feature, you're able to like get more out of like a medical kit rather than just stabilizing somebody. Actually, like you know, do some get some more HP to somebody, and then
Yeah.
it helps boost classes that already do any sort of healing spells or anything like that. It just you're getting more bang for your buck, and
Yeah.
that was one of the feats that I was talking about that can be used to try and make quote unquote a D&D healer class, but like I said, that doesn't at this point doesn't exist. But yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
not to get too long-winded, but yeah, that's my answer to that.
No,
Is I
I
would.
agree. I think you're very right. There are a lot of feats that end up benefiting more on the side of combat, and it really is left to the players and the DM to figure out a way to make it role playing.
Mm-hmm.
Do I think that they should have some feats that give you the ability to affect things outside of combat? Yes.
I mean, all I can think of is like the mobile feat that's really good for just movement utility, which is crazy, right? If we want to talk about utility. But I think for social interactions, the best thing you can get is like the lucky feat. So just being able
Yeah.
to re-roll, is it two or three dice a day? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, that could be game changing in certain scenarios.
It could be. And here's my devil's advocate point to feats for outside of combat.
Mm-hmm.
What are they all going to have to rely around? It's either going to have to be based on rolls for skill checks,
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you.
which is going to land in a couple of camps,
Yeah.
right? It's either going to be for things that people have already complained about not being enough of in game, aka the
Yep,
ranger abilities,
yep.
right? All the survival, the hunting, the foraging, the
Mm-hmm.
perception, all that stuff.
Yep.
I honestly, what else are you going to get other than that, or social interactions? Now, the moment we get into dangerous social interactions is, or the moment that social interactions become dangerous
Mm-hmm.
is when you give players essentially a Jedi mind trick,
Yes.
right?
Yes, I
And
completely agree with
it's
you.
essentially what the lucky feat is that you go into a conversation and someone says, "Hey, does this
Intimidate, intimidate, intimidate.
yeah, does this crown make my head look fat?" And you go,
Yeah,
"Yes." I mean, shit, no. And that's your saving throw,
yeah, 100%. Yeah.
right? Especially when, and again, this is one of those really difficult things with D&D, and this is where I think we should leave it off, is asking the viewers and the listeners what they think on this one.
Yeah.
Is that when it comes to social interactions, is the onus not on the players to say exactly what they think they should say to
Mm,
convince someone of something, as
right.
opposed to saying, I roll to get them to do what I want them to do?
And yeah, that's a big one. That's a big conversation piece without a doubt. And I know I'll tell our listeners this. Honestly, there isn't a right or a wrong answer because it depends on the player at the table and their social like real world charisma score, shall we say, right? And so if somebody wants to roll for something, then let them roll for it, honestly. And if they're if they're confident enough and able enough to speak up and say something, again, we have inspiration for a reason. You can reward them for doing it that way. um, and I'm saying this, prefacing this, because even if they say something that's really awesome, next level witty, you still should make them roll for it and don't give them advantage. I see a lot of DMs do that. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. but I would say rather give them inspiration for having had the gall to, um, you know, to role play, right? That's what the inspiration's there for, is as a reward to do that. And as a result, inspiration does give you just a re-roll. So it's like giving advantage anyways in a scenario. So just it's inspiration, guys, that you're looking for, not just advantage on in that moment. Like let them, have that inspiration to be used at any point in time. So yeah,
Yep.
I agree. That's where I'd leave it off. I'm happy with that. The last thing that I will say though, just to get my last piece in there for that hot take there on is, I mean, ultimately I think, I mean, yes, it's yes to that. The fact that the features of of the classes and subclasses are pointed more towards combat because they need to be, in a sense, in the way that the system's built, the way that fifth edition is built, because like we talked about in the DMG, if social interactions and social scenarios are governed by loose guidelines that are far more um, to the DM's discretion as they are in 5th edition, because that's what allows us to play the plethora of different ways we would all like to play at our tables, right? Um, then just focus. Okay, on this class, like you're able to do like A, B, and C, you know, and just focus on that. And you know, on the outside, that's what the flavor text description is for. But I do agree. I understand people's need for wanting to have more things that can influence things in social interactions. But this is my only pushback, and this is the last thing that I will say for this entire podcast other than signing off. James, you can respond however you want and take it from here. But my last thing is this: in social interactions, the last line of defense is the DM. And right, you could, like your example, right? Like you could literally try and persuade the heck out of a king to give you his kingdom. It does not matter if you roll in that 20. That does not mean it's an automatic success. That just might mean he doesn't kill you and chop your head off for the insolence of even making that joke. Um, and at the end of the day, if you had features that had some sort of bonus to social interactions, um, that could just be easily and rightfully so within a DM's powers just completely subverted instantaneously. And then that would create so much more flare ups at any given table. I think that's why they're just like, okay, we'll have these
Because
features
suddenly
focus on the combat. Sorry, and carry on. Uh,
you would have the DM negating a feature that someone has on their character sheet versus saying, no, he's not convinced, he is not going to hand you the keys to the kingdom.
right? And what is easier and less conflictious, right? Exactly.
Exactly.
I completely
So,
agree. And sorry, the last thing too is like, yes, like there are features and can be things of certain subclasses with like charm person, those sort of spell effects that do like dominate one's minds. And then yeah, we're into a deeper conversation about things like consent and I mean, there's a like whole thing around that. But I mean,
yeah.
yeah, you could have a more socially viable character that way, but in the bad sense, I guess, quote unquote, because it's like, yeah, they're really good at uh, charming people, and like that. There's some dangerous lines to walk, right? I
Mm,
that those are forced sort of social interaction mechanics, essentially, right?
yeah.
And again, like it could create a bad image, and I would say just in bad taste, because then you have a player character and perhaps a subclass that would then just start doing a lot of bad things, not only just in the game itself, but also to players around the table. And I'm just going to leave it there. James, take her away, good
You
sir.
know, I think you make a really good point there. And I'm going to cap this off with a neutral point. This game is so nuanced, not because of how it's built or anything like that. It's just the premise of D&D is to create the most realistic fantasy escape you can have, which in and of itself, in a literary sense, is an oxymoron.
Right.
And the thing is that not only is it nuanced in that sense, in the fact that the intent is to be able to do anything fantastical in a fantasy world. But on top of that, it is further nuanced by the fact that each and every individual who plays it changes how it needs to be played based on how they roll and the decisions they make. Like I've said, I've told you this one before, but I had players absolutely surrender to an orc encampment instead of fighting the scouts to get away. They just surrendered. Which I had to go, okay, well, what's stopping these orcs from just murdering these guys right here? Because they just handed everything over.
Yeah.
Right? So every decision further defines the game and therefore has to smudge another area to make it work, if that makes sense. So having hard and fast rules and hard and fast anything in a game this nuanced is very difficult.
It is. And the one area it just seems to be is in the area of combat, because that could be the one pillar that all players and people can lean on, and for DMs to have some sort of thing to
sanctuary.
Like, thank you, sanctuary, so that when things are just not going their way one night, or they're just like, oh man, my description's just sucking right now, at least like maybe there's something that they can bank on, is like, well, I got a good encounter planned at least, like, or something like that, and the players can come away being like, oh yeah, well, I mean, I don't really know what was going on with that subplot, but like, hey, we had great fun in that fight.
Yep, and we had a real good tavern brawl.
And maybe it's also the one thing that will universally unite both DMs and players in terms of things to talk about around the table, because most DMs can't talk about the other aspects, because that's for you guys to literally experience in T-minus 30 seconds. Hold on. Can't talk to you about the exploration mechanics, or can't talk to you about this or that, but combat though, yeah, absolutely. And that's something that everybody will have to learn, and learns right out the gates, and it's probably also the one area that rules lawyers types of players are going to have any sort of footing on for conversations, right? And yeah, and I think it's the one aspect of the game that can be standardized, whereas so many other things you can customize it to your like. Here's the thing, right? Ice cream, billions of different types of flavors, but what's the thing that unites the ice cream for dairy ice cream, right? Is the fact that it's still iced cream, right?
Yeah.
That, I guess that's where I'm going with that. The combat mechanics is the ice cream, and
you can have your combat, your social interactions, your tiger stripe, your bubble gum, your vanilla, your chocolate, your raspberry, whatever.
Yep.
I agree. And with that, I think we should do our quick sign off and thank everyone for listening. So I just want to say thank you all for tuning in to our very first episode of the Wizardly Warehouse Productions podcast.
Yes.
And I think the final thing we're going to say is we are also on startplaying.games. And what is startplaying.games? Startplaying.games is a website where you can join DMs from around the world, I want to say, and play Dungeons and Dragons or any other tabletop RPG. And you can find us on startplaying.games/GM/through-the-rift. And with that, we will see you through the rift.
Nice.